would be a very good thing for Scotland, and I think actually in some ways a very good thing for the Scottish Labour Party as well.
Jamie, Michael, can I ask you something just briefly on what you were saying there?
Mm-hmm.
At the opening, because one thing that you were sort of touching on was this idea that if there's gaps between the Tory position on what more Devo-something they might offer, if the Liberal Democrats have one idea about their Devo maybe, and if Labour adopts a Devo-something else, then that's likely to be a problem. I think that's an argument if you pay an awful lot of attention to these debates and you're interested about precisely which powers lie where. I think the political question is a wee bit different. It's about whether the public think it's sufficiently credible to convince them to vote no. And actually, I'm not so convinced as many Scottish nationalists are that gaps and significant differences between the three parties is actually going to be as damaging as a kind of a better together persuasive device as people maybe think it might be. That's my view anyway. I don't know what the other Andrew and Jamie might think about that.
Jamie?
Well, I think Nicola Sturgeon's claims that a no vote will effectively kill Scotland's Home Rule journey dead don't ring true, and they won't ring true for most Scottish voters. So I think in that sense, I'm entirely with Andrew Tickell. It's sort of something unpersuasive about the nationalist position there.
This is a point I also made in a recent article, which is that I think regardless of the outcome of the referendum, I am convinced that there will be some form of radical constitutional change happening over the next few years, in part because the cat is out of the bag. Devolution has been an irreversible change, and the pattern you're seeing with devolution, whether it's for the London Assembly or for the Welsh Assembly, has always been towards greater powers because there's a demand for it. I think that's one of the reasons why it's specifically Westminster MPs who are more likely to be against extra powers on the grounds that it makes their job appear more null and void.
Of course, they're the ones that will have to vote on it.
That phrase, the cat is out of the bag, speaks to the nature of the split at the top of the Labour Party. The reason Ian Davidson and Jim Murphy are so desperate to avoid the devolution of further powers is that they subscribe to the Tam Dalyell theory, the slippery slope theory, that more devolution will lead inexorably to independence. I would suggest that the history of Scottish politics, the recent history of Scottish politics, reinforces their fears.
I think we should just get on with it and vote for independence. But that brings us to the next topic with Lamont still. But did you see the couple of train wreck interviews during the week? Sorry, I'll say that again. Were you aware of the couple of train wreck interviews during the week? Were you aware of the train wreck interviews? Andrew, Mr. Tickell, were you aware of these interviews?
Well, I think it's important to have that debate, and I'd support having that debate about being aware of the interviews. I saw them.
A cynical attempt to try and shut down the debate, Andrew.
I must say, I focused on the dearly beloved Anna Sarwar, who is my parents' MP back in Glasgow, and I was up there for the general election in 2010, so I had the pleasure of voting against him. He also went to my secondary school, which I consider to be a black mark against his name, and makes it very difficult for me to treat him fairly. But I think, the reason people are vague, the reason why it's vague and difficult to explain their positions to impertinent journalists to ask them searching questions is because people haven't fundamentally agreed the fundamentals. And it's not surprising, therefore, when you put yourself up to kind of defend a floating position on more powers or what have you, that you're not going to be able to give a persuasive, definitive answer because you haven't even got your own Bally Tribunes on your own side yet.
The question is how long people like Johann Lamont can go on with this ludicrous obfuscation. How many more interviews are they willing to humiliate themselves in before they just decide that they need to have a clear position on the constitutional question and they need to have a clear policy platform?
A psychological question or a political one?
And Mr. Smith, you're a Labour Party member, as I've already said. Have you spoken to Ed Miliband about this? What's his view? What's his view?
I've never met Ed Miliband. I think that I agree with exactly what other Andrew said, which is that the reason why I've only heard one of the interviews, the Good Morning Scotland one, and I think the reason why the interview was such a problem for her was because there isn't a fixed answer or a fixed line on any of this. And I think one of the issues of timing is it's been timed to coincide with a conference, which means more media attention, which inevitably means more interviews, which means if you haven't come up with your answers, then you're in a bit of a pickle.
But a party which was run by an efficient and sophisticated press operation would be able to train their leaders to handle those sorts of situations. One of the major problems the Labour Party in Scotland has just now is that it has an extraordinarily poor press operation. I don't know if people receive their press releases. Some of them are misspelt. They frequently claim that the SNP government or the SNP party as a party is pursuing policies which it isn't pursuing. I would refer you in this instance to Neil Finlay's obsession with this 10% figure when it comes to the SNP's position on corporation tax. He's completely convinced the SNP wants to implement a 10% corporation tax. He can't find a single source to justify his claims. So I think that's something that the Labour Party in Scotland needs to look at very, very seriously and very quickly.
Well, there's an interesting article about that on Newsnet Scotland this morning about Nixonian tendencies in the current kind of Better Together campaign and Labour as well, where they'll just pay absolutely total, they just have a total disregard for the truth sometimes and just run with whatever they feel like running with.
I was going to say that part of the issue relating to press offices, and I've worked in a few press offices in my time, is that there might be like amateur mistakes such as spelling or something, which we definitely shouldn't be doing as a professional political outfit. But from any press officer's perspective, if you don't have fixed answers to the big questions, then there's only so much dancing on a pin that you can do. And there's only so many ways you can say, I don't know. So anytime that
If only Johann Lamont would do that. If only Johann Lamont would just say, I don't know. But she can't even bring herself to that level of clarity.
Politicians find it very difficult to say, I don't know. Or it's almost as bad, if not worse, than a climb down, which politicians can't do as well, without at least some way of saving face.
I would agree with that, but I would also suggest that had she taken a strong line one way or the other in the interview, then there would probably be briefings one way or the other for or against her appearing in the papers tomorrow. What's clear is that she has a very divided party, and she has a very hard job when there isn't any fixed policy, and I don't think that she's in a strong enough position internally to necessarily be asserting what that fixed policy is.
Mr. Tikau?
Yes, well, I think that's probably true. I mean, I often think strategically, if something is inevitably going to come up, so if it's inevitable that the members of your own party are going to dissent, if you're kind of haunted by the ghost of Tam Dael, who I should say is still among the living, but if your party in Westminster is full of those people and you have pretensions or are at least formally leader of the Labour Party in Scotland, I don't think you can get away from them by avoiding them. I think that quite often it'd be much nicer to hear people saying, well, fundamentally, in this party we disagree. I think I'm right. I'm going to try and persuade my colleagues, and win over them. And I'll win this debate in the party and recognise it as a debate as opposed to some other sort of trying to evade it through rather incompetent press strategies, which can't possibly achieve the outcome that is desired.
Speaking on press strategies, there was one thing that I found very noteworthy in both the Good Morning Scotland interview that she did and in the webcast. She was being questioned about the Taylor donation, and with no sense of irony, she changed within a minute to say, I think the donation's fine, but I'm worried about people shutting down the debate. Wait a minute, haven't you just seen what Ian Taylor's been doing? It was within a minute of each other, she did it twice, and also in the same time expressed her confidence in the absolute probity of Alistair Darling, regardless of things like expense claims and Iraq wars and whatnot.
Lucky for him, I don't have anyone that could swear to my probity. Can I also pick up one thing from her speech, actually, to take two steps back, which sort of struck me as quite strange. She said that this debate is not between Scotland and England on the Constitution, which is right, but she then proceeded to say it is a debate between Scotland and salmon, and Scotland will win, by which she means that the dismal Eck will be duly trounced by the Scottish electorate and sent homewards to think again, or something obnoxious like that. But it's amazing to me that that kind of rhetoric that suggests that the nation against the nationalist makes sense. Because if I turned it round, if I tweeted in an innocent and mischievous fashion that the independence debate was a question about Scotland against the Labour Party, or Scotland against Miliband, or Scotland against David Cameron, or something of that ilk, you're pretty sure they'd go ballistic. That would be regarded as a grotesque, appropriation of the nation to serve venal political goals. And I think it's quite interesting that you find this from the Better Together campaign and from the Labour Party, who are never tiring of making these kind of allegations against the Nats, against Scotland, and very strange to my mind.
There was one other little strange thing I noticed, which was Darling at the Labour Party conference, who used an interesting choice of pronoun. If you vote yes, you are on your own, which I thought was kind of interesting for the leader of the Better Together campaign. And at the same time, there was an interesting little slip from Lamont in one of the interviews as well, where she said, we want to create the view of the people. Oh, sorry, the party. Which I thought was an interesting kind of little slip as well.
Well, I suppose Lamont's remark about the debate being between Salmond in Scotland is an echo of Douglas Alexander's line, which was, I think, it's a clash between the settled will of the Scottish National Party and the sovereign will of the Scottish people. In some respects, it's quite a powerful line, because the reality is that support for independence remains quite low, and support for devolution, an enhanced form of devolution, quite high. Again, though, I think this comes back to the fundamental question about what devolution is and where it leads. I've always felt, along with lots of other people, Tamdale included, that devolution has a logic and a momentum of its own. Ian Davidson and the Labour Westminster dinosaurs have exactly that same feeling. Hence their hostility and the divisions at the top of the Labour Party and throughout the Labour Party as a whole. It's worth mentioning as well that divisions go to the heart of the Labour movement and are not concentrated just at the top of the Labour Party. There's a huge tension just now, a huge conflict just now, a debate going on just now in the Scottish trade union movement. And there was an article even in the Daily Record this morning suggesting that there had been some shift in the attitudes of some Scottish trade unions away from the Union, away from the Labour Party, and towards independence. And that will only serve to massively ramp up the pressure on Johann Lamont.
Mr. Smith?
Yeah, I think there's an argument to say that the debate happening in the Labour Party about what devolution means is almost a mimic of the debate happening in the wider country, because I think it's fair to say that while all the polls are suggesting people want more powers, I think it's actually quite vague about, the conclusions are quite vague on what more powers means. And I think there's an argument to this. Ties into that point I was making earlier, that this is a debate which should have happened years ago over a longer period of time, which is that I think all three of the pro-union parties are all having internal debates themselves about what it means, because the country are having debates about what the union means. The nature of Britain itself is changing, whether it's the Welsh Assembly gaining more powers, whether it's all that mayoral stuff happening down here in England, or whether it is the changes of the Scottish Parliament. I think also the very notion of what it means to be British is being questioned like never before. So in a sense, it's almost refreshing that there aren't any fixed answers yet on what more powers means and what the future of devolution means.
Well, there's also actually a thing we haven't mentioned it yet, but Ed Miliband, of course, came up to Inverness to Eden Court to give his speech to the Scottish Labour Conference, in which he revived his riff, his theme, his story about a one nation Labour Party, which essentially I thought was interesting insofar as it claimed that it made the argument that Thatcherism as a political ideology and Scottish nationalism as a political ideology essentially both fall foul of the one nation argument for slightly different reasons. That on one hand you have the rich divided against the poor instead of everybody caring for each other and having a sense of social responsibility, and therefore Thatcher is bad. On the other hand, you had Alex Salmond, the SNP, being accused of a similar breach of the one nation story, in which we were dividing Scots from the rest of England and sort of breaking up Britain in that way. And I think what's interesting about that for me